You're watching or listening to Private Members Club, and for the next 2.5 minutes, we're going to be saying goodbye to Boris Johnson, so you don't have to. The liar's punishment, said George Bernard Shaw, is not in the least that he is not believed, but that he cannot believe anyone else. Now, I was looking for pictures because we always have pictures when we start these podcasts, and I came up across a page of quotations, none of which were to do with Boris Johnson, but all of which seemed to fit. So I thought, sod it, we're going to thread them liberally throughout this 2.5 minute podcast. I'm JR.
I'm John.
I'm Simon.
And we don't need to give Boris Johnson any more than he deserves, do we?
Well, you know, before you speak, you've got to ask yourself if what you're going to say is true, it's kind, is necessary, is helpful. So if the answer is no, maybe what you're about to say should be left unsaid. So yeah, 2 minutes is about right.
So we're diving through these quotations as quickly as we possibly can. Before, I'm not really planning to do this in 2.5 minutes, but I don't want to give him too much time. It looks, I think, reading between the lines, that he's going to go off and become the editor of the Daily Telegraph. Do we know this?
No, because the Daily Telegraph is up for sale.
Yes, the Daily Telegraph is up for sale to somebody who's just been given a knighthood in Boris Johnson's resignation honours list, with whom Boris Johnson's been having secret meetings about what they'll get up to now that Boris Johnson has resigned, been kicked out of his seat. So it's a strong possibility that he could become the next editor of the Daily Telegraph and start sticking the knife in Rishi Sunak's back from there.
Oh, can you imagine? I mean, the Telegraph is going to be supporting Labour in the next election, maybe? My God.
It's a weird situation, because Boris Johnson's entire career has essentially been a case of leapfrog, but always leapfrogging like across boundaries. So he goes from being booted out of one newspaper to becoming editor-in-chief or whatever it was of another. And then the next thing you know, he's in the London Mayor's office. And then the next thing you know, he's a backbench MP. And then he leapfrogs into, some cabinet position, gets booted out of that cabinet position. And 6 months later, he's foreign secretary. And then the next thing you know, he gets booted out of that and he's prime minister. It's a bunch of leapfrogs, none of which take place in any kind of natural sense. There's no natural progression to what he does, but always his career is about these sudden massive leaps forward that kind of come out of nowhere. And I guess the point I'm making is, it seems like a really weird leap then, once you become prime minister, for your next leap to be, well, going back to being the editor of a newspaper, because, you did that 20 years ago.
Well, this is a man who described Prime Minister's salary as chicken feed, wasn't it?
Well, quite.
So, yeah, he's going to get paid a lot more just for being on the Telegraph.
He needs to do something for the money. Right, since we're racing through these quotes, Simon, you must have one in front of you. Do you want to read me one out?
Oh, this old chestnut.
Go on.
You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. So has time run out?
But these quotations that sort of popped up on my feed while I was looking for a picture, they weirdly seemed kind of relevant to me. So I want to dig into them just a little bit. So let's start there with that one. So obviously these are famous sayings from famous people, and that's Abraham Lincoln, of course. You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time. And that is the story of Boris Johnson's career. But you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And what Lincoln is basically saying there is, if you live a life that's a lie, eventually that life will find you out. Even if, I guess the subtext is, even if it's not the people who find you out, it's the lifestyle that will find you out. And I think that's true of Boris Johnson, that there are still millions of people in this country who believe in him and who would still back Boris Johnson. And I don't think this is the end of the Boris Johnson story necessarily by any shot. He even says it himself in his resignation statement right at the end there. It says, at least for now, as if he's predicting his own comeback in a couple of years. And maybe we'll touch on that a little bit in a minute. But yeah, Simon, he's lived this life that's been, it's not so much that it's been a lie, but it's just that he's not cared. He doesn't care about the people around him, and he doesn't care about the wider country. And eventually that was going to bite him on the backside, wasn't it?
I mean, he's the embodiment of entitlement, isn't he? Surely, you know, he's grown up with no inkling that he shouldn't do what the hell he likes, and hasn't had the limitations that the rest of us have had, and therefore, yeah, goes through life saying, well, I don't see why I shouldn't do those sort of things. And I think when he does come out with some of this stuff, I think he believes it the same as everyone else, because he's just kind of creating this reality for himself.
Yeah,
and it is almost like a new religion that people like him and Trump will
Both
engage in. Say again?
Both New Yorkers.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, technically.
Exactly.
See, all this, it kind of goes back to me. There's a quote, I think David Cameron did a children's program interview just before the 2010 election. And one of the kids asked him one of those like quietly brilliant questions, why do you want to be prime minister? And him being a patronising git, because think I'd be good at it. And that's that
Boris
kind
Johnson,
of
though,
yeah,
isn't it?
and it's that Bullingdon Club thing. It's him, Osborne, and Johnson. It's a network of contacts. They've got the safety net that they're never going to fail. And I think I remember from education, I think it was a conversation about education rate rankings, and teachers were complaining about it, and the Conservatives criticised an all shall have prizes mentality. And my immediate thought was, well, that's what you've got, because you've got the contacts to make sure that you eat the prizes up, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. It's not what you can do for other people, it's what the position can do for you as much as anything else. Going back to the quotation that I came in with, the liar's punishment is not in the least that he is not believed, but that he cannot believe anyone else. And for me, that one rang true because of the statement that Boris Johnson gives, which, as Simon kind of alludes to, it comes out of a place of entitlement. But my God, it's like a Mardy sort of toddler throwing his toys out of the pram, isn't it? This resignation statement. I've never seen anything like it.
Well, David Allen Green, brilliant commentator, as he said today, he looked at it and went, the telling thing was he had that sort of the Partygate findings earlier in the week, and there was no attempt whatsoever to spin it to say he was exonerated or anything. And as pointed out, if there had been anything that remotely exonerated him, there would have been something leaked to the press pretty damn quickly. And there was nothing except, it's a kangaroo court who wanted to find me guilty. And as he pointed out, everything was stacked for you. You have, it's a Tory majority committee.
Not even a Tory majority of the six voting.
Yeah.
No, not even a Tory majority of the 6 voting members on that committee. 4 of them are Tories, 2/3 of it. It's not just a majority, it's a massive majority of the voting members of the committee.
Yeah, and then you've got Parliament, again, they have a majority there. Who
Parliament have got to vote through whatever recommendation is made, has to be voted through Parliament, through their 80-seat majority, before it can be. So it's not about, he made out that it was about Labour and about Brexit. It's not. It's about the other Tories stabbing him in the back as he sees it, really, but he can't bring himself to say it.
It's the same tactic as Trump this week.
Sure.
It's just, okay, I'm banged to rights, so I'm just going to attack the integrity of the people involved in the process.
I said on Twitter that I thought this statement was a bit like this election's been rigged and stolen from Trump. But that's not strictly speaking true, because I think he's already, I think Johnson did this election's been rigged and stolen thing when he lost the prime ministership. I think this actually is his equivalent of the January the 6th thing. This is him. This statement is not him saying I've been pushed out, but this statement, I think, was him attempting to make a rallying cry amongst his grassroots support out in the country from all those people who turned to him at the Brexit general election in 2019. So all those red wall voters who suddenly went blue to vote for Johnson. only turned that way because of Brexit and because of Johnson, and not because of Tory or Labour. It was nothing to do with party politics and everything to do with personality politics. And I think his idea with this statement was as a rallying cry to those people to try and drum up support to some. And whatever Matt says about Johnson's not coming back, even though he's on a plane back into the country, and Trump's not coming back, even though his name's virtually on the ticket already, I think these guys want to be back. And I think Johnson, whatever other considerations there might be about money, I think he still feels he's got something to prove. And I still think he wants, if he can possibly manage it, to come back. And I do think this statement is a rallying cry to try and make that happen. And I think it's a really badly misjudged one. And it's sort of egg on the face time. What do you think, Simon? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to slip into magical thinking where you think, oh my God, he wants to come back and he will come back because he got voted in before. But I kind of feel like he's this kind of awkward sized penny in the pockets of the Tories, and you've got a hole in your pocket, and it falls into your trouser legs. So you're trying to, and I'm wondering about these jumps that he makes. I mean, either he's got something over somebody, is why he makes these massive jumps in position within government, or are they just trying to filter him through? They think we can't get rid of Boris, but the best way to get him through is to just get him up there as high as possible. He's bound to make mistakes, and he can fall on his own sword, and we can get rid of him.
Or possibly they think, well, nobody would ever vote him in as prime minister because he's a buffoon. So if we put him in that race, he'll get sunk and he'll disappear. And of course, he wins it exactly the same as the Republicans thought with Trump. Nobody thought Trump would win the Republican ticket, and he did. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, nobody's going to vote him as president, are they? And they do. That's the amazing thing that happens is, it is down to rhetoric and personality, but it does happen. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah.
One of my friends on Facebook posted a picture of Trump just after he won the election, and he said, "Look at this face. This is not the face of a man who expected to win the election." He was doing that as I think it was either avoiding charges or getting the focus elsewhere, and all of a sudden he has to run the country for 4 years. And there's a brilliant book called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis, which tells you how absolutely terrible he was for the infrastructure of the country for 4 years.
Well, for sure. And Boris Johnson is just basically the same thing over here, to all intents and purposes.
And you look at both things both of them have in common. They can't admit they've lost ever. It's always someone else's fault. There's always a scapegoat. And I've read Anthony Seldon's Boris at 10 book recently as well, because he does a biography of every prime minister just after they finished, and he's scathing on Boris Johnson. He takes, Boris Johnson's supposed areas of expertise, classics, Shakespeare, and politics, and the people he likes to compare himself to, and then he goes, "No, actually, he's like these more terrible people. These are more appropriate comparisons." He can't be seen to be a loser. I think this is why he jumped so quickly from being an MP, because he did not want to face that by-election, because he could have lost that by-election, and there's that mystique gone.
I also think there's a vague possibility that there's sort of an underhand motive at play there too, in as much as it looked like Boris Johnson was going to leave that seat anyway and move to a safer seat, because in the next election, it could have been a lot closer. He might even possibly have lost it in his own right if he hadn't have moved. So there was a case to say that he was going to leave that seat anyway and move to a safer one. By jumping now...
The thing is, I used to live in the seat that Boris Johnson currently holds. Again, back in the 20s. It is solid blue Tory. Even then, I was living there at the height of New Labour. It was absolutely rock solid blue. And I think
his majority is only 7,000, and that was for the prime minister. So that's not a huge amount, really, is it?
It's going to, but they, I think the other story that's going in with Boris, it was the honours list, which is obviously absolutely appallingly awful. With the cronyism but they denied Nadine Dorries a peerage, because they didn't want to face a by-election in her seat, and her majority. But the thing think Boris wants to jump to is 24,000. if they're worried about a seat with a 24,000 majority, I'd love to see what
Yeah,
their
yeah.
internal polls are telling them, because it must be
Well, exactly.
horrific.
Yeah. As I understand it, the honours list is not been ratified yet, so it still potentially could not happen. So I guess we wait to see what happens with that. But yeah, so I'm not sure there wasn't something going on there. I think whichever way it falls, Boris Johnson is always looking for a way to do things that will allow him a doorway back in somewhere else. So although this looks like, the immediate news was greeted with a lot of people being very happy that Boris Johnson is no longer an MP, thinking that's the end of the story. I don't think that's the end of the story. I think that's just a twist. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe that Boris Johnson can come back, but I certainly wouldn't put it past the British public to vote him back, because as much as we look at it now and think Boris Johnson has lost a massive amount of support, there still is a pretty massive amount of support, and you're never stronger than when you're at your lowest ebb, and the only way is back up.
Well, the thing I have is that essentially the Tory electoral policy, particularly since probably 2015, has been to maximise a kind of smaller share of the vote. So, there's so many people will think of voting for us. How do you maximise that kind of thing? They don't even think about nearly 50% of the electorate would never think of voting for them. We've seen that, particularly since Brexit. They don't care. So everything they've done has been to play to that audience, which I think is where a lot of us who don't agree with them maybe miss what they're up to.
Well, and of course, Johnson only got 1.2% more votes than Theresa May did in 2017 when he won in 2019.
But the success there is that they put the Corbyn scare factor in.
Exactly. And so
it wasn't that Labour vote.
It wasn't that they won by a huge amount in a huge number of seats. It's that they won by a tiny amount in a huge number of seats that had turned. And so it was about how the vote had turned from Labour rather than turned to the Tories. So it was because Labour's vote crashed rather than because the Tories' vote sort of massively grew that Johnson got in the first place. To go back on. Yeah. Oh, go on.
God, no, I think what's really going to trouble the Tories up till the next election is this COVID inquiry that's ongoing, because they've called in George Osborne, so that's going to put the austerity in the spotlight. Johnson for the direct response. Sunak is going to be in there for, the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. It's going to tarnish pretty much the entire past 13 years, keep it in the public eye in the lead up to an election. That is going to be horrific for them.
But you know what I think is that if that's the case and all the rest of the Tories are looking like losers and Johnson spends a year out in the cold and he's the guy who won this massive 80-seat majority back in 2019. Now, I don't think necessarily that what will happen is that Johnson will come back and resurrect himself and the party. But I think what's in his mind is that he'll come back and resurrect himself and the party. And I wouldn't put it past a certain amount of A, the electorate, and B, the Tory parliamentary party to be behind him if he should make such moves. So whether he'd be successful, and we all know that Johnson likes to, if he doesn't think he's going to be successful, he likes to pull out before, he gets found out.
Someone else taking the blame. So
exactly.
You think he's going to avoid this whole crash and then come back as a saviour figure?
I think he's going to avoid the whole crash and then see if the grounding is there for him to come back as a saviour figure. So we might not know one way or the other, but I'm certain it's in his mind.
Wouldn't surprise
Going back to my I did have one more quotation. Let's drag it out. Oh, and this is from Seneca, or Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger from ancient Rome, and we do know how Boris Johnson loves a classic, right? He says, if one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favourable. And again, that to me was very redolent of Boris Johnson's resignation speech, where he seems to blame absolutely everybody for the troubles he's brought upon himself, basically because he didn't know which direction to point his ship in. He pointed his ship in whichever direction a favourable wind seemed to be, whether it was Brexit or this thing or that thing or whatever else. He just seemed to do whatever he thought would be the thing that would bring him personally the most success, whether that was at a cost to the country or not. And in the end, again, that's the kind of thing that finds you out, because this is the whole point. If you don't have an ideology behind you, then you're actually doing things for shallow, superficial reasons rather than because of any deeply held beliefs. And that's Johnson all over, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the hallmark of these, again, the past 7 years, particularly since the Brexit referendum, has been that they have been blaming the blob or civil servants or teachers, faceless kind of people, really. They've had a kind of amorphous targets where they can go, it's them.
It's this group, that
Yes,
group,
it's
rather
this
than
group
this
and that
person,
group.
that
Yeah.
person. Yeah.
Yeah, almost random, like Remainers, or Ramonas, however they wanted to make.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, yeah, it's a kind of really horrible, cynical way of doing politics. I believe it was originally Dominic Cummings' idea, funnily enough, when he was in education with Michael Gove. So,
Wouldn't
yeah.
surprise me. Dominic Cummings, for all that we hate him, is a very clever man who understands how these things work.
He is, but he's also, frankly, psychopathic in a lot of ways.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. And that's a horrible combination. But what I mean is, I believe that Cummings understood how things worked better than Johnson did. And that's why I think Johnson starts to fall when Cummings moves out of Parliament, because no longer does.
I kind of think they don't particularly understand how things work. It's because they, again, going back to your quote about the headwinds.
Oh, not he, just Cummings. Johnson
Cummings,
not.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Because Cummings he wanted to basically run like a tech company, move fast and break things. You can't do that with a country, because if you break bits of it, you've got to put them back together, or there's a penalty to be paid pretty damn quickly.
For sure. But I think the things he wanted to break were the things that were inside Parliament. I think it was Parliament he wanted to break and put back together, and not necessarily the country itself. I think that was the problem, is that he's trying to put Parliament back together in a new way. And of course, again, you're right, that's not going to happen. Certainly not that quickly.
He wanted revolution rather than evolution. I think if you're putting it in with these institutions around the country, or the public services, councils, civil service, teachers, the NHS, it needs evolution rather than revolution, because otherwise, if you're having constant revolutions, you just end up with a lot of wreckage to sift through.
Simon, let's cut this short now. I think we've talked about Boris Johnson quite long enough. Any final thoughts about Boris Johnson, Simon, before we give him a score? Because we like to score things out of 10 on this podcast.
On what basis?
Before we give him a score and move on. I'm not actually going to ask you for a score.
No, it would be negative.
But yeah, any final thoughts? I mean, as things stand, it looks like we've seen the back of him from Parliament. Who knows if that will continue to be the case? But if that is the case, I mean, just his premiership, his parliamentarianship in a nutshell.
He's one of these people who are just tiresome, and everyone sniggers about them behind their back, and they just, and you think as long as he has no effect on life, then it's all well and good. He's harmless enough, but he's not harmless, and that's the thing about him. He is tiresome, but that quote from Star Wars: "Who's the biggest fool? The fool or the fool who follows him?" And that's all I take from it. Really, is the same as certain other characters who we're all putting up with at the moment, is that they are symptoms of a wider problem with society. And that's my biggest worry.
Well, this is a bigger discussion than we can really have. But let's ask the question very briefly: is this a symptom of social media? Because social media allows us to create and form and follow opinions faster than anybody can stop us from doing it. So do these people turn up, and these parties, this Tory government that's leaning further and further and further to the right, is that happening because they're the ones who can get the opinions out there and formed quicker than anybody else?
Partly, but also I can't remember who said it, but it's kind of, you had the people with the more extreme opinions. They were I don't think there are that many of them, but social media, it's like any new technology. I mean, I'm not saying they're anything like the Nazis, but look how they use the new technology of cinema, of of visual media. Again, social media is like that. It's people, before we fully understand the consequences of it, they're finding a way. They're not waiting to see the consequences. They're just using it like they do, and it links up these kind of smaller celled people, so they can actually talk to each other now. So they may appear more, how should I put it, more numerous than they are. They have a kind of a louder voice.
Right. On that note, I'm going to give, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Boris Johnson 0 out of 10 until we do this again. I was JR.
I was John, and I'm giving him a 0 too.
Yeah,
A 0 too.
Simon. There's a yes, it's a 0 from me as well.
And we will speak again soon.